Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture Podcast, where we talk about everything dog. Q&As with veterinarian professionals, rescue operators, everyday topics. We cover everything dog on this podcast. So make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture Podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you're following us on social media on both Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for listening. Now here's that next episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture Podcast. This is your host, Brittany, and today we're going to talk about spaying and neutering male and female dogs based on age and breed. So there was a study in 2020, or the results were released in 2020, that analyzed 15 years of data. They looked at over 40,000 dogs, covering 35 breeds in total. Basically, they were looking at the decision-making based on age of spaying or neutering those dogs and the association with joint disorders, cancers, and urinary incontinence. Now, a lot of you, like me, probably think in a little bit of that old school way of spay and neuter as early as possible. You know, more often than not, after that 6-month mark, usually before that 1-year mark. I think that's what a lot of us have been told. And it's important to kind of use this data to make sure you're making that better decision for spay and neuter. Now, even though we're going to talk about spaying and neutering at different ages based on different breeds, it is important that I just say spaying and neutering is so important for overall population control, especially given the current animal crisis that we're seeing. And so I think erring on the side of spaying and neutering earlier is better. You would be surprised at how many accidental litters, I put that in quotes, accidental litters that are seen. You know, your dog gets out, they hook up with another, a friend's dog comes over, you babysit, whatever the case may be. It happens more than you think. And a lot of those litters end up at the shelter, end up abandoned. And so that's why spaying and neutering is just so important. And so I have to say that before we jump into this, okay? Now, like I said, you can go look up this study. If you were to Google spay and neuter study based on age and breed, there's a handful of articles that take a look at it or kind of cite to the results. So there was something published by Frontiers, something published by, I believe it was NIH that did it. There's a lot of different ways to kind of look at this. And if you look at this a little more in depth, it will give you specifics for the breeds that were looked at. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about it a little bit. And let's talk about what they looked at. Okay. So like I said earlier, they were looking at joint disorders, cancers, and urinary incontinence. For joint disorders, the study looked at the recurrence of hip dysplasia, cranial cruciate ligament tears or ruptures, and elbow dysplasia. As for cancers, the study looked at lymphoma, mast cell tumor, and the next few are tough. Hemangiosarcoma and osteosarcoma. Those are tough. And it also, like I said, looked at urinary incontinence. Now, this isn't an end-all be-all study. Like I said, it only looked at 35 breeds, but there were some generalities that were pulled from this, kind of grouping some of the small dog breeds and looking at some of the larger breeds. Now, let's talk about the breeds specifically. I'm going to go through that list so that if you hear a breed that you have or you're looking at getting, this might be helpful. But like I said, not all inclusive. There's certainly some breeds that were not included. Okay, so the final list of breeds, and there's actually 3 varieties of poodle, so I'll say that before I start. The final list of 35 breeds include the Australian cattle dog, the Australian shepherd, beagle, Bernese mountain dog, border collie, Boston terrier, boxer, bulldog, cavalier, King Charles spaniel, Chihuahua, cocker spaniel, collie, corgi, the Pembroke and the Cardigan, the Dachshund, Doberman Pinscher, English Springer Spaniel, German Shepherd, Golden Retriever, Great Dane, Irish Wolfhound, Jack Russell Terrier, Labrador Retriever, Maltese, miniature Schnauzers, Pomeranians, a miniature poodle, standard poodle, and toy poodle, Pug, Rottweiler, St. Bernard, the Shetland Sheepdog, Shih Tzus, West Highland White Terriers, and Yorkies. Overall, they found that the vulnerability to joint disorders associated with neutering is generally related to body size. And when we talk about body size, you can kind of categorize small dog breeds and large dog breeds. So for those small dog breeds, Boston Terrier, Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, Chihuahua, Corgi, Dachshunds, Maltese, Pomeranians, toy poodles, pugs, Shih Tzus, Yorkies, they did not appear to have an increased risk in joint disorders with neutering compared to breeds of larger sizes. Now, and this is just for the joint disorders. As far as the breeds of larger body size, they did find some differences, and even within those large breeds, they found differences therein. And so that's just to say, if you have a large dog breed that was on this list, I would definitely go look at that study because they do make indications as for the age that your dog should be neutered and lessening that increased risk of a joint disorder. Now, overall, there are some different charts that are available with this study, and we'll kind of talk about some of the dogs and what they suggested, and then we'll get into a few of the specificities. So, for example, the Doberman Pinscher was actually notated as possibly leaving intact. And then if we're looking at the, choice, kind of decide when you want, spay and neuter beyond 6 months, spay and neuter beyond 11 months, spay and neuter beyond 23 months. Now, there's a difference between males and females. So there's a lot of moving pieces in this, and we can't necessarily give generalities to all of it. But for example, in female Australian cattle dogs, it was suggested to wait beyond 6 months to spay a female Australian cattle dog. Whereas for the male, they didn't quite see such an issue. And so they said kind of at your discretion. And now if you look at the beagle, for male dogs, their suggestion is to neuter beyond 11 months. So you see that with male dogs with the beagle, the border collie, the Boston Terrier. And then if we look at the category of waiting beyond 23 months, we see breeds like the boxer, the standard poodle, and a few others. Okay, so just some of the generalities there. Let's jump into some of the specifics. Now, Australian cattle dogs, I mentioned that earlier. They found in females there was an increased risk of a joint disorder with spaying that occurred prior to 6 months. And so for females, they suggested spaying beyond 6 months for an Australian cattle dog to lessen possibly that increased risk of a joint disorder. For Australian shepherd dogs, for the female, it was suggested spaying beyond 6 months to remain vigilant in reducing particular cancers. For beagles, it was noticed in males a possibility of increased risk in joint disorders if they were neutered between 6 and 11 months. And so for male beagles, they suggested neutering beyond a year of age. For the Bernese Mountain Dog, with respect to males, they noticed an increased risk of joint disorders. And so it was suggested to delay neutering of a male Bernese Mountain Dog until well beyond 2 years old. So that's pretty significant from what we traditionally think. And so for those Bernese Mountain Dogs that are males, there is that significance there. Interestingly enough, that same significance was not necessarily found in female dogs. So that's not the same guideline there at this time. There was a noticeable increase in the risk of cancers for female border collies between the ages of 6 and 11 months. And so it was suggested to hold off until the dog, till the border collie is beyond a year old. And they actually found some significance there with males. And so also for male border collies, waiting beyond that 1 year mark. Boston Terriers, they noticed an increased risk in cancer with males when neutering through 11 months of age. That suggested guideline for male Boston Terriers is to delay neutering beyond a year of age. For boxers, there was a risk of increased cancers for both sexes, and so they suggested spaying and neutering beyond 2 years of age for a boxer. Now for the bulldog, this one there wasn't necessarily a finding of an increased occurrence of joint disorders or cancers. And so this one is somewhat left to the discretion of the owner at the direction of their vet. But there was a possible suggestion to just be cautious of a possibility of an increased risk of joint disorders, it wasn't very significant in this particular study. Now for Cocker Spaniels, the guidelines for males is neutering beyond 6 months of age. As for females, there was an increased cancer risk for dogs that were spayed at around a year old. And so they have suggested spaying beyond 2 years of age for a female Cocker Spaniel. So you can kind of see some of the recurring themes here. Like I said, you can somewhat categorize these into small breeds and large breeds, but even then there's a difference between male and female. So I certainly encourage you to just Google this study. If your dog is on the list, gave that list earlier, you'll see in some of the smaller breeds, whether it be like a miniature Schnauzer, a Pomeranian, a few of the others that we've already discussed, they've essentially left the discretion up to the owner and the vet. And on that point, this is so important to discuss with your vet. Is your vet aware of this study? Maybe you kind of make mention of it. Hey, I heard of this recent study that was published around 2020. They looked at different joint disorders. They looked at different cancers. And while we didn't necessarily talk about it on here, the study did also look at that urinary incontinence because there are some breeds where they suggest delaying spaying a little bit older because of the risk of urinary incontinence. Nevertheless, just mentioning this, keeping this, in your back pocket, making sure you're informed and that you're making informed decisions with your vet. But overall, just speak to your vet on these particular issues. I think it's important to kind of bring this study to light. I don't know how many vets are familiar with it. It's interesting. I've personally brought it up to a few vets and I'd say it's 50-50. 50% of them didn't really know about it or they haven't really looked at it. The other 50% are starting to use this as part of their guidance in their practice. And I think there will be more to come from this. There's certainly more breeds that can be looked at. I think it could get a little more in depth. And so I think over the next few years or, a continuation of this, I think we'll start to learn a lot more. So would love to hear from you guys on what you've heard from your vet with respect to ages for spaying and neutering. Thank you guys, as always, for tuning in. Please share this with your fellow dog lovers and dog parents. Follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, we are on Facebook, and we're on LinkedIn. So feel free to share, follow, subscribe. And as always, just thank you guys for being a listener of the Canine Culture Podcast. Thank you for tuning in to the Canine Culture Podcast. Please make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture Podcast on your favorite podcast platform and make sure you're following us on social media. If you have any recommendations, any topics that you'd like to hear, if you know of any guests that would be good for the show, or if you yourself want to be a guest, please reach out to us. Send us an email at canineculturepodcast@gmail.com or send us a direct message on social media. Thank you for listening, and please share this with any of your dog-loving friends.